Two topics and two big questions on today's episode. Is the UK economy on the up? And where could tensions between Venezuela and the United States end up? That's what we'll be discussing on today's episode of Newscast, the BBC's daily news podcast. Hello, it's Tristan from The Global Story in the Newscast studio, standing in for Adam.
And it's Faisal here in the Newscast studio, standing in for myself.
And in part two of today's podcast, we're going to be looking at the rising tensions between the US and Venezuela, asking where everything that's going on right now in the Caribbean could actually lead. But first, Faisal, some good news for the government today when it comes to the economy and interest rates. Before we get onto the substance of this, though, you've been at something called a lock-in at the Bank of England. What's that like?
Okay, well, there's a couple of things that happened. Yeah, the lock-in is a period of time before a big decision, a big announcement. Normally, in the case of the Bank of England, it will be an interest rate decision, where a small number of us get to hear what has happened a little bit earlier, about an hour or so earlier, but on condition that we are locked with no devices inside the vaults of the Bank of England. I assume rather close to where the gold is. But we don't get to see that. We don't get to sit among. I know it's sounding very glamorous at this point, but no, it's in a rather tedious and boring conference room.
Yeah,
which is deep underground.
Do they check you for devices?
Yeah. You check them in.
But did they do like an actual search?
Well, there's no reception anyway, so you couldn't get anything out.
Okay.
Anyway, even if you tried, but it's very important and that's the quid pro quo. The point here is we're not just responding to the individual announcement of the rate cut as it was today, but the deliberations around it, some of the considerations about where things might go in the future, some of the disagreements on the 9-member committee that decides interest rates.
Yeah.
So it just helps you have a little bit of extra time to contextualise before you put your headlines out, before you put your initial takes on the story. So that's the idea behind it. It does help with our telling of the story. But we obviously absolutely, it's not that we're not allowed to, but there can't be any possibility that we could, if we wanted to, tell any of that story in advance. And we saw what happened. I mean, it was a different context. We saw what happened with the Office of Budget Responsibility, early inadvertent release of the Chancellor's budget measures last month.
Well, the rate cut from 4% to 3.75%, this is good news for the government, isn't it?
Yes. So firstly, one should probably consider this as an accumulation of 6 cuts we've had over the past year and a half. So that's quite chunky, substantial. These things bizarrely take extra, for many people, they'll take extra time to see the benefit from this because 90% of people are on fixed rate mortgages. So you have to physically wait until that mortgage comes up. But how it affects those fixed rates that are on offer is often in real time, often ahead of time. They're predicting these rate cuts in advance and they respond to that news. So although physically the pounds in your pocket depend on when you're taking a mortgage out, and indeed if you are a mortgage holder, plenty of people rent, plenty of people have paid off their mortgages, the pounds in the pocket may be delayed, but your anticipation that the bump in mortgage rates that affected you 3-5 years ago when rates were very high, which was, I know, hundreds of pounds increase, like a case study we've got on the 6 and 10 o'clock news, £1,000 a month. You start to anticipate that that's going to go away in 6 months' time or a year's time. So it can affect your sense of how much money you have to spare. So it can affect confidence in that way, but it's a bit diffuse. Now, you ask a very important question about credit and whether the government will feel vindicated by this. And certainly that's the message we got today from the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, for a very specific reason, which is that the bank gave credit, if you like, to the fact that the budget was very carefully aimed, in part, at trying to get the headline rate of inflation down. So the headline rate of inflation overall went up, but given that, the Office of Budget Responsibility, for example, said, well, actually, these measures, things like the energy bills measure, taking just over £100 off bills, freezing rail fares, freezing prescription prices, that they contributed to a 0.4 percentage point reduction in what the rate of inflation would be in April. The Bank of England actually says it's a little bit higher, 0.5 percentage points. That's quite a chunky take away from inflation. And then the question is, how does the bank respond to that? Is that a real cut in inflation? Is it a slightly weird one that you shouldn't really account for? Well, as I said, on behalf of broadcasters, I've been talking to the Bank of England governor, and he said, yes, well, actually, a year ago, when we had the budget and that contributed to inflationary pressures, Andrew Bailey said, well, we sort of called that out and we said this is part of a challenge in terms of the inflationary situation. Now they've done the reverse and it is helping us cut. So he was pretty clear in giving that credit. So that is why I think you heard from Rachel Reeves today, the Chancellor, sounding quite vindicated. However, they also pointed out that the economy is subdued and certainly we've heard from the Leader of the Opposition, from the Shadow Chancellor too, that they blame that on some of the uncertainty around the budget, and that hasn't cleared up. And so you're left now with, like, where is the economy going? And you have this sort of pre-Christmas jolt to the festive spirit, potentially, from the so-called Santa cut. But there certainly was some uncertainty that weighed on economic activity and confidence for consumers and businesses. What the bank goes around asking businesses, do you feel better now? And they say there's been no rebound, but perhaps a gradual appreciation for the fact that the uncertainty around the budget is over. So I think all roads lead to January and February and March about where the economy goes. And I think there's an awful lot up for grabs right now.
Well, I mean, the uncertainty over this seems to have been reflected in the decision making, because the committee that decides these things, the Monetary Policy Committee, voted 5-4 in favour of the cut. Where was the opposition coming from? What were they worried about, those people who were against it?
It's a bit of a battle. It's a battle between a subdued economy, subdued jobs market, with unemployment going up, growth flat, actually contracting a little bit in the last 3 months, 0.1%, and fears about inflation becoming entrenched, about the perceptions of the UK being particularly inflation prone. You do not want that in the markets. You get punished in the markets, and it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling doom loop of, well, hang on, you're a bit of an outlier, therefore we're going to charge you more to borrow money, therefore your situation is worse, and therefore we're going to charge you. That hadn't really triggered, but people started to ask questions about why the UK's inflation uniquely was higher. Some of that has been allayed by a sharp surprise fall in the inflation rate that came yesterday, further allayed by the idea that there'll be a chunky fall in inflation in April, partly as a result of the government's very specific budget actions aimed at reducing that. Not everybody was convinced by that as being a real cut in inflation. And there are just different views. There are different views as to what the biggest threat is right now. And essentially the 5-4 went from 5-4 the other way in the body of the governor, of Andrew Bailey, deciding to change his vote from hold to cut. And that, again, relates to a sort of marginal change of view about when the right timing was for a cut, about its effectiveness, about what the biggest risks were. He was just more convinced, and so he's gone with the idea that we should cut. Rather interestingly, he has now also suggested that from now on in, that decision about further cuts into the future will be a closer call. And the markets have interpreted that. We've pretty much had one cut every quarter over the last year and a half. And so the natural way to interpret that is, well, maybe that slows down to like one every half year. So expect a couple of cuts there or thereabouts next year, not 4 cuts as we've had this year. So that would still take interest rates to 3.25%. But some had expected them to go as low as 3 or below. That kind of depends. That probably wouldn't be a good sign. That would be a sign that they were trying to rescue the economy from recession and were not worried at all about inflation. So that's the balancing act. It's a very tight balancing act. You can see it not just in the 5-4 vote, the 5-4 from 4-5. You can see it actually in the individual deliberations of those 9 members with themselves. They're arguing about these within their own sort of expertise as well.
Well, before I let you go, Faisal, we're coming to that time of year where we look back and we look forward and we reflect and we predict. Where do you think that Rachel Reeves finds herself at the end of 2025? Because it's been a bit of a bumpy year.
Yeah. No, it has been bumpy. I mean, clearly, totemically, having pushed the welfare cut in order to promote economic stability, but then finding it promoted actually pretty profound political instability, enough to raise questions about the economic stability. So that whole roundabout was problematic. I think actually, and this is a slightly non-consensus view of the budget, what were they trying to do with the budget? They were trying to land it with the markets, land it with the backbenchers. That could have been an impossible task, but they've managed to square that. Markets are calm. Backbenchers are calmer than you might think. You leave it to Chris and Adam and others to assess exactly where the politics of all this is. And now she really does need, which is why the interest rate cut is important. It's necessary but not sufficient condition. Really does need those savers who are saving and not consuming. Savings rates super high right now in the UK, kind of more than you possibly expect. There's a despondency out there that spreads well beyond, towards people that probably could afford to go out and spend. Are they going to go out and spend? Are they going to feel more confident about the state of the economy, the state of the country, to go out and spend normal amounts? Are businesses going to feel confident enough to invest? Again, not huge amounts, just normal amounts. We would see a pretty strong pickup in the economy, even if things went back to normal. So I think that would be the modest hope for January and February. It's not certain. Politics could play its hand again in terms of the uncertainty coming back. And it may just be, ironically, that signs of a better economy will come by March or April. But does that align with the political timetable of those tough local elections in May?
Well, if people are saving money, that means that there is money that they might be able to spend if they wanted to. Is that right?
But this has been rolling for some time now, and it's particularly amongst older. Obviously, most savings are with older, wealthier people who've been around to save. But they have saved much more than you'd expect. And actually, part of that is the very point of cutting interest rates, which is no one wants to say this publicly, but the way in which the channel through which it works is to squeeze savings income and persuade at the margin people to spend a few tens of pounds rather than put it in a bank account because they're fearful about the economy. There's an amazingly interesting psychology around savings. People don't like to be told what to do, but interest rates send a clear signal, and that is part of the very point. Get people spending, get people saving. For now, they don't feel confident, haven't felt confident enough. And so that is why a sense of stability, a sense of people like me not going on the TV wondering if more taxes are going to be raised kind of every couple of weeks. That should be settled. That should be settled at least for several months next until June or July. The next budget shouldn't be till next October or November. So that should be settled. So that could feel quite different. But it would be such a change from what we've become used to. Now, we thought this year, this 2025 that's ending, would see a calmer year, less political and economic instability. We didn't quite get it. Are we going to get that next year? That is the Chancellor and the Prime Minister's great hope. And that should provide some space for consumers and businesses. But we're still at the stage of if.
Faisal, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Now, something we've been talking about quite a lot over on The Global Story, where I come from, Newscast's cousin news show, is the rising tensions between Venezuela and the United States, which actually seems to occupy quite a bit of our time. It all goes back to the beginning of September. In September, US airstrikes against boats in the Caribbean started, boats being blown out of the water, allegedly because they were carrying narcotics northwards to the United States. And then there was a military buildup in the Caribbean of US ships and US troops and US planes. And all of this seems to be moving potentially in the direction of a US intervention in Venezuela. That's what the Venezuelan government are saying. So what we want to talk about today is where this really could all be heading and where it could end up. And joining me from Washington is my co-presenter on The Global Story, Asma Khalid. Normally, she and I are co-hosting together. Today, she's my guest, which is a pleasure. And
a pleasure to be with you.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us, Asma. And with me in the studio here in London is Vanessa Bush-Luter, who is the Latin America and Caribbean editor for the BBC News website. Thanks so much for joining us, Vanessa.
No problem. My pleasure.
Vanessa, can you take this back to September and tell us how all of this started?
I would go back even a little bit further to the election in July of last year when President Maduro tried to be re-elected, and the opposition put up a candidate. It was Maria Corina Machado, who has now won the Nobel Peace Prize, but she was barred from running, and she then threw her weight behind a different opposition candidate, Edmundo González. And after the election, the National Electoral Council, which is dominated, it has to be said, by Maduro loyalists, declared Maduro re-elected, but the opposition had voting tallies showing that its candidate had won. So that already caused friction with a lot of nations, including the US. The US recognized Edmundo González as the president-elect, and you can imagine that that did not please Mr. Maduro. And since then, of course, President Trump was re-elected, and since he's started his second term in office, he has been ramping up the pressure on Venezuela. So even before those strikes on the small boats, we had the reward that the US is offering for information leading to the capture of President Maduro doubled from $25 million to $50 million. And then we had those strikes, as you said, starting on the 2nd of September.
Okay, and so do we know how many people have been killed in these strikes?
It is now more than 90. So the first strikes tended to be in the Caribbean, on small vessels in the Caribbean, allegedly transporting drugs. Now it's moved more to the Pacific side, and that is actually more logical because a lot of the cocaine that is transported from South America to the US actually goes through the Pacific and not the Caribbean. It's about 70 to 80% of the cocaine that is going the Pacific way.
Asma, can you remember when it was that Donald Trump first started talking about Venezuela in these quite forthright terms since he came back to the White House?
I mean, to echo what we just heard, I think it is undeniable that the United States' relationship with Venezuela has been tense for quite some time, dating back, even as we say, to the Biden years, right, when we saw Maduro retain his power there in Venezuela. But I think what the big difference to me, Tristan, is the return of Donald Trump to the White House. That is when we have seen this relationship systematically take a turn and, frankly, the tension escalating. I would say the big point of escalation was September when we saw these boat strikes begin. They have been extraordinarily, I would say, complicated and debated in political circles here in Washington. We've seen both the Senate and the House of Representatives debate whether or not these are, in fact, legal, that this is being done without any sort of congressional authorization, as is normally the case. And just shorthand here is that in order to actually enter into a war, there needs to be congressional authorization. And we're seeing the Trump administration not just blow up these boats in the Caribbean and now the Pacific, we've also seen them systematically build up a kind of naval blockade around Venezuela. And we've seen, I would say, just a heightening of both military escalation, but also of rhetoric. And just one last note here is that I think that the rhetoric has been getting far, far more tense. And just this week, we saw President Trump post on his Truth social media account that, he sees the Venezuelan regime, his words, as a foreign terrorist organization. He accused the Venezuelan government of stealing American oil and talked about there being the now largest armada in history around the South American country and, threatened that it could even become a worse situation for Venezuela. And so a lot of us here in Washington are wondering, well, what exactly is going on here? And is the president sort of building the case now for possible intervention?
Well, the White House has kind of laid out its stall early on, saying that drugs were kind of one of the primary reasons for these strikes. Vanessa, is that what they're still saying, though? Have things evolved?
I think things have evolved a little bit over the last days since that tanker was seized. A tanker that was sanctioned by the US was seized by US forces. So a helicopter took off from the USS Gerald Ford, the largest aircraft carrier in the world, which has been cruising in international waters just off the coast of Venezuela. And US Coast Guard US Coast Guard officials boarded that vessel, and it's now on its way to the US. And since that happened, there has been a lot of talk about oil. And as Asma said there, President Trump posted on Truth Social about oil. He accused Venezuela of stealing the US's oil, and he said that the pressure wouldn't stop until it had returned that oil. Now, that's where it gets a bit strange because, yes, Venezuela nationalized its oil industry, but that was back in 1976. So we're really going back 50 years here. And for Trump to make that case is rather thin.
Well, oil, it feels to me like oil has sometimes been kind of like the elephant in the room in all of this, because Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves, even more oil than Saudi Arabia. But it feels like this week, people in the United States, in Washington, started talking a little bit more openly about oil as being a possible objective of the United States in all of this. And this kind of came about when Donald Trump posted a very long message on Truth Social a few days ago. Asma, what did he actually say?
Yeah, and let me pull this up here because I think it's worth quoting the president in his own words. It was a very lengthy post, but his words here, I'm going to quote a portion of it. He says, "The illegitimate Maduro regime is using oil from these stolen oil fields to finance themselves, drug terrorism, human trafficking, murder, and kidnapping." He also said in this post that the largest armada ever assembled in the history of South America is surrounding Venezuela, and that it will only get bigger, and the shock to them will be like nothing they've ever seen until such time as they return to the United States of America all of the oil, land, and other assets that they had previously stole from us. It's a very long post, so there's a lot more in there. I mean, I do think this is the most explicit reference we've seen from the president and from his team about oil in this context. But Trump, I will say, is a sort of confusing, I think, politician to me in many ways, Tristan. And I think it is worth going back to what you said here at the outset, which was that initially this seemed to be about accusations of drugs entering the United States. And that is for much of the president's first year back in office now in the White House, that's been the argument we've heard about Venezuela. We've heard them refer to Maduro as the head of a drug cartel. We have heard that as being the legitimate basis, they say, for blowing up these boats in the Caribbean. They have described them as being narco-terrorists. They have went on to, say that fentanyl is a weapon of mass destruction. We've seen the language of terrorism and war being used in the context of drugs. And the purported explanation we hear is that they are trying to prevent drugs from Central America, South America from coming into the United States. And so I found the shift rhetorically in the last week to be really striking. I think one of the things, though, to keep in mind about President Trump is, he is somebody who I think finds certain leaders around the world to have a certain degree of kinship with him. And I don't know that I actually see a policy basis for some of this. And Tristan, we've talked about this a bit on the Global Story, but if you look at his actions in Central and South America recently, he bailed out the Argentinian president financially, right? He pardoned the former president of Honduras, who was in fact a convicted drug offender here in the U.S. courts, right? And he pardoned him. So if this is really about drugs, I think there's a question that many people are asking, which is, well then why conduct these other actions? And so it strikes me as that, President Trump often finds a kinship with world leaders around the globe, and Maduro is ideologically not aligned with him.
Yeah, I think he has less of a kinship with Nicolas Maduro, doesn't he, arguably? Vanessa, what's been the response, though, from Nicolas Maduro to all of this from Donald Trump?
Well, there's been an interesting shift there as well, because when the US hit those small vessels, there was not that much outrage on the part of Nicolas Maduro, because that didn't really hurt him. I mean, some Venezuelan nationals, we don't know exactly who the nationals that died were, but we presume that some of them were Venezuelans. That's what the US has said time and time again. But President Maduro did not express condolences to the families. In fact, there are reports that reporters have been kept away from the villages from which some of these people came, the ones that were killed on those boats. So during those times, he was seen composing rap songs in defiance of what was going on. He was seen dancing and speaking to his supporters. Now that tone has changed. With that seizure of that oil tanker, he's talking about piracy. He's talking about theft, about attacks on the country's sovereignty. And he's also called a meeting of the UN Security Council, which will happen on the 23rd, so next week. He got the backing of China and Russia for that. So he has been making a lot of phone calls to people that he sees as his allies. It has to be said that neither China nor Russia have been really all that outspoken in their support of President Maduro recently. They have been keeping very quiet. But there has been a lot of diplomacy going on behind the scenes, and he is certainly much more strident now, and I think he's very worried. And that's because oil accounts for more than 50% of the government's finances, the oil revenues. So being deprived potentially of those revenues is a massive loss. And because his position is quite tenuous, I mean, there's a huge majority of people in the country who want to see him gone, and he has to have the backing of the armed forces. And if he can't pay the armed forces, then he could lose that backing. There's already there are already a lot of reports of low-ranking soldiers being disillusioned because they're just being paid a pittance. So if those salaries were to dry up, then those soldiers could turn their back on Nicolás Maduro, and that would be really dangerous for him.
Well, Asma, I want to go to you for our last question here, because there has been a certain amount of speculation online as to whether or not the United States could even declare war on Venezuela. Tucker Carlson has even been talking about it, the conservative media commentator and podcaster. What would a war against Venezuela even look like? Are there troops in the region, any kind of US military buildup?
We've certainly seen a naval military buildup, right, surrounding Venezuela. We've seen Coast Guard sent down to the area. But in terms of what any sort of military action might look like, I think one of the key questions for President Trump, at least from my vantage point here in Washington, is how he navigates this from a domestic political context. He returned to office on a promise to make America great again. He has often prioritized domestic issues. There are a lot of key domestic concerns here around issues like affordability, the price of groceries and utilities. And there are some within his own party who question his global interventionism and his global sort of outlook this second term. And I do think that is a question he will have to wrestle with. That all being said, Tristan, several weeks ago now at this point, there were reports that the Trump administration had authorized some sort of covert action, possibly inside Venezuela, CIA covert action. And I do think that raised a lot of alarm bells. I will say one last point on this, which is that there have been questions about trying to put some limits on this from the standpoint of Congress. But at this point, Democrats do not have the numbers in either the Senate or the House. And we see that Trump has been able to act as he wishes with very little very few restraints on his power there, as in terms of blowing up boats and other actions that he wants to take in Venezuela.
All right. Well, let's leave it there then. Thank you so much. That was Asma Khalid for us from Washington, D.C. And with me in the Newscast studio here, we've had Vanessa Buschluter. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a total pleasure.
Thank you.
Good to talk to you.